الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام سيدنا محمد وآله وصحبه أجمعين أما بعد. Respected brothers, little ones, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome to the weekly Ministry of Dawah talks. We have Brother Nawaz inshallah to talk about Battle of Badr part 2, and inshallah I'll pass it on to him now.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم إن الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا من يهد الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له ونشهد أن لا إله إلا الله ونشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. As the brother mentioned, inshallah today is a continuation from Imdad's talk last week, where he really discussed the surrounding situation on the lead up to the Battle of Badr, the video which we just saw in from the film The Message. Inshallah, what I want to do today is carry on the discussion that occurred and really take it from the perspective from after the agreement had been made to fight the Quraysh at Badr. And really I just want to take one or two examples from the reality, from the situation, and just draw some lessons that we can maybe look at in our own lives today, inshallah. So, like I said, moving on from the discussion last week, the Muslims, the Prophet ﷺ had consulted the Muslims, and they had agreed to fight and to go to the plains of Badr, and then to fight the Quraysh at the plains of Badr. So when the Prophet ﷺ arrived there with the Sahaba and the army that they took, they set up camp. At which point, a Sahaba by the name of Al-Hubab ibn al-Mundir, he raised a question to the Prophet. And this is really the first example I want to draw upon. And the question he asked to the Prophet, he said, Ya Rasulullah, he goes, concerning this spot you have chosen to settle, is this from wahi? Is this from Allah? Is it revelation that Allah He told you to stay here? Or is it from your own opinion, i.e. from strategy or war? Or warfare? I.e. the Sahaba is asking Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam that you've chosen to camp at a particular point on the plains of Badr. Is this from your own opinion that you've chosen to stay here, or is it from Allah, i.e. revelation? At which point Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam, he replies, it's from my own opinion, i.e. from my own view on strategy and warfare. At which point Al-Habab ibn al-Mundir, he then responded to Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam, and he said, Ya Rasulullah, it's better for us to go past the well, so the well is behind us. Yeah, and to set up the camp past the well. Now, just discussing this situation very quickly. I don't know if any of you have ever been to a desert. You know, one thing you realize when you're in a desert, there's a shortage of water. So, in any situation, when you have a shortage of water, what you want to do, you want to protect to make sure you have enough water. Because if you don't have water and you're trying to fight, you know, you're not going to last very long, especially in a desert. And hence, in the plains of Badr, there was actually a well that existed where you could actually have water, where people could draw water from. And when the Prophet ﷺ, he settled before the well, i.e. given the Quraysh access to this well as well. And this is why Al-Hubab, he raised to Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam, why don't you place your camp after the well, i.e. separating the Quraysh from the well, i.e. making it more difficult for them to gain access to the well. Hence the Muslims could have the water behind them, so it could easily replenish their thirst during the battle, whereby making it more difficult for the Quraysh to gain access to the water during the middle of the battle. And as you can see, it's in the middle of the desert, plenty of sand and heat. So, the first lesson that we can really learn is that, you know, you need to make it as difficult as you can for your enemy when you engage within them. And the point I want to draw from here is today in the Muslim world, yeah, the enemies of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala have descended upon the Muslims and are attacking the Muslims day and night. Whether it's Afghanistan, whether it's Iraq, or whether it's Palestine. And what you find is that our rulers, rather than following the sunnah of what happened in Badr, they do the opposite. They actually give the wells of Badr to the enemies and say to the enemies, take from the water of Badr, drink from this water and then fight us. And the example I'm giving here is not about the water that they drink from the plains of Badr. What you find instead is that our rulers, they allow the armies of America and the British and the Allied forces to be based from the Muslim countries. So as an example, in the Qatar and in Kuwait and in Dhahran in Saudi Arabia, the Saudis and the Kuwaitis and the Qataris say to the American forces, come build your bases in our countries, and then from these bases you can actually launch your war against Muslims in Iraq, Muslims in Afghanistan, or Muslims in Palestine. And it's not just their bases. They say to the Americans, use our airspace to fly your planes over on your bombing missions in Iraq, Afghanistan, in Gaza. So it's not only the bases they give the air as well. And it's not only the air, the ports. So for example, the American army engaged in Afghanistan, their supplies come through the Karachi port in Pakistan. So again you find the Pakistani government allowing American armory and allowing American replenishments to come through the Karachi port, to go through Pakistan, to go to the American troops in Afghanistan, which they then use as food and as weaponry to kill Muslims in Afghanistan. Not more, and more than this, where do you think the oil and the petrol comes to fuel the tanks that these Americans use to kill Muslims in Afghanistan and Iraq? Where do you think this petrol comes to fill these tanks? Again, it comes from the fields of Kuwait and in Saudi Arabia. And then finally, another example to illustrate the treachery and the disobedience against Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We find during the Gaza war, when the Israeli soldiers were attacking the Muslims of Gaza, where do you think their food rations were coming from for the Israeli soldiers? You know, when you're in war, you get little packets of food that you keep in your rucksack so you can eat during the day when you're engaged in fighting. Who do you think made these little food packets for the Israeli army? It was actually exposed in one of the Arab media that these packets of food are actually made by an Egyptian company. An Egyptian company making food to supply the Israeli army with food so they can replenish their energy to fight against the Muslims of Gaza. So again, the first lesson we learn from the Battle of Badr and where they placed their camp, where Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam and the Sahaba placed their camp, they placed their camp in a position that made it more difficult for the enemy to fight the Muslims. But yet what we find today, our enemies and our governments, I should say, rather than make it more difficult for the Americans to fight the Muslims, they make it more easy by allowing them to place bases, to allow them to use their airspace to fly their planes, by allowing them to use their ports so they can bring in shipments for their refreshments and replenishments, and by fueling their planes and tanks, and even by making foods that we can feed the soldiers that then point the guns and kill our mothers and our sisters. A'udhu billah. So that's the first example I wanted to draw upon from this one example of the Battle of Badr. And the second interesting example really is that what you find throughout this Battle of Badr were the Muslims engaged in strategy, thinking about where to place the troops, thinking about how to build their command tower. So there's a discussion amongst the Sahaba about how to build a command tower that the Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he can then climb and then he can oversee the fighting. There was a discussion about who should surround this command center. There was a discussion about how the Muslims should place themselves as they attack the Quraysh. So there was an ayah in the Quran where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala commented about this, about how the Muslims formed rows. There were rows of Muslims, like how you saw in the film, how there were rows of Muslims, how they would march forward to engage the Quraysh. Point being here, all these examples show how much preparation and planning went into this fighting and this Battle of Badr. That it wasn't they just decided to go there, wave some swords in the air and decides to fight the Quraysh, but rather they engage in a deep strategy, thinking about how the Quraysh would come, thinking about where we should place our camp, thinking about how we should engage with them, what tactics should we use. And the real irony of the situation was, the Muslims engaged in a battle which they thought so deeply about how to fight and how to engage the enemy, yet they were already promised the victory of this battle. That even before they had engaged in one sword fight, or one arrow that was fired, the Muslims had actually already been promised victory in this battle. Even before they even sat down and thought about how we're going to fight the Quraysh, where should we place our camp, Who should we engage with the Quraysh? How should we sword fight